How was that? Isn't that lovely?
That was nice. Okay.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Andrew Bear.
Has started. Dynamite.
Good afternoon, Scott Baker. How are you today?
I'm good, Mikey. Do you consider admired leadership to be, our field note is entitled, How Flat Should Your Organization Be?
Yes.
Flat is not necessarily a word that often comes to my mind when I'm thinking about organizations. Maybe it should be. But are we a flat organization? How flat are we?
I think we are. I think we're relatively flat because I think we have two layers. Like that's the way to count it. Not necessarily like where your hierarchy is, but I think we only have two layers, right? 3?
Yeah.
Well, no. It's like 2.5 layers because it's not like somebody else's executive assistant is something that I can tell them to do. So in some parts of our organization, it might look like we have 3 layers, but in the meat of our organization, we only have 2.
Yeah. Now we only have 100 people in the organization or so. We don't have 100,000 or 600,000 like some organizations. So the question is, I think for everybody is, well, if you're going to spend a little time with us, we're all gonna understand more about how our organizations work, our families work, because this is just about like how many layers between the front line and where you are. There's an obvious metaphor here for the cake, which comes into the field note, which we'll talk about. Right. I did not realize that there is a big danger to organizations that are too flat, like not as they're as flat, and we'll get to that as well. But I think if you're going to layer in here with the layer cake analogy, then I immediately go to the difference between, say, a 2-layer of an ice cream cake, where one layer is the cake and one layer is the ice cream. Or since my father-in-law is Hungarian, and so part of that has been, we went to Budapest and we had to go do the whole thing because in Hungary they have a thing called a Dobostort, which could have like 12 layers. And the guy that created it was a little layer of cake and a little layer of buttercream, and then they put this hardened caramel around the whole outside. Why did they do that? Well, it preserved it better back in the 1880s, right? And you get this delicious cake that's 12 layers. And you could get Dobostorts that are 6 layers. But my wife's grandmother would be like, no. It has to have all 12 layers. Well, there are organizations that are like, well, we have this. Here's what the org chart looks like. You don't want to violate the org chart. And then you have other organizations that are like, we just don't even have, there's no managers. There's just nothing. Everybody just kind of does what they want. Well, all of those can fall apart pretty fast. Let's figure all of this out for everybody, all in one discussion.
All right. Well, how about a baseline first? Like, what's a typical organization look like in terms of flat? So let's choose HubSpot as an organization. I recently heard the CMO of, actually, he's the SVP of marketing at HubSpot. His name is Kieran Flanagan. He was on a podcast called the CMO Podcast with Dave Gerhardt. And this guy, Kieran, was also the former CNO at Zapier as well. So he's been in a few. And they were talking about CMO stuff. They were talking about, by the way, it was a great podcast and I think you should listen to it. But Kieran offhanded mentioned how many direct reports he had. Which kind of speaks to how flat or tall an organization
HubSpot is. Yeah.
Yeah. So
now by the way, we are HubSpot clients.
Yeah.
And,
not bad mouthing anybody at all here.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And HubSpot is a major organization, $20 billion or something like that. Maybe more than that. I can't remember.
Right. So let's test our comments a little bit. So Scott, I'm going to ask you to guess how many he had, and then get ready, no matter what platform you're on listening.
How many total direct reports or how many layers of direct reports?
He said it offhanded, the number of direct reports that he had. And he said a number. He said, I have about, and he said this many number direct reports. So you say the number that you think Kieran said out
I'm
loud.
going to say 42.
42. Okay. And so if you think it's higher or lower in the comment, no matter what platform you're watching in, just type in higher or lower so that we can see in our comments, where you're coming from.
Yeah,
so just humor us for a second and just type in higher or lower. We can see whether or not you're coming from Twitter.
And there's no layers between you and us. We're going to,
it will be completely flat. So anyway, Kieran said 250
direct reports.
And
those people have people that report to them.
I'm guessing they do, because he didn't say any more about the rest of his hierarchy, but it just made me realize, HubSpot is a giant organization. They've got tens of thousands of employees. So the fact that he, as the vice president of communication, has 250 direct reports, my first thought was about our conversation about one-on-one meetings from last Friday, right? That was my
Right.
first thought.
Couldn't happen. He would do nothing else.
Right. And my second thought is like, oh, how flat is this organization? So as I read through this, like having 250 direct reports, kind of was on my mind as we went through this notion of like, what is too many layers and what is too few layers, right?
Right.
But it seems as if that if you're going to have tens of thousands of employees, that has an implication as to whether or not 250 direct reports is enough or too much, right? It just seems like it's an incredible number when we think back to the one-on-one conversation. But here, I mean, it's a demonstration of a flat organization, which I wouldn't have thought HubSpot we've dealt with on the phone, 3 different layers. So I know there's 3 different layers. There's got to be an extra layer between the people we've spoken to and Kieran, right? So it's a very tall organization, but it's also, they kind of operate their individual teams as if they're flat as well.
Well, and I would say that was our experience, and one of the reasons why we worked with them, which is, and organizations like HubSpot are in the business of helping facilitate relationships between actual people, which is the beautiful thing.
And this is a great story. When we were actually evaluating, a competitor of theirs was somebody that we were evaluating, and it might have been due to their hierarchy and social structure that we felt like they couldn't really make any decisions. There was nobody on the phone that we can get with that would actually help us think of us as an individual customer, right? And so that's just a problem that comes with not being very flat, right? Is tall the other word here? I know that we were talking about
I suppose
hierarchy.
So. Yeah. I suppose so. And hierarchy comes into the play in this field now. But remember, the whole point of this about like is not like, do you have a nice, pretty org chart where it all makes sense? The real barrier is you have a plan to succeed as a business, an organization, a family, an athletic team. How many layers of decision are there between your concept and actually getting it done? And is that helping or hurting? Because you might say, well, the fewer the better. Well, sometimes no. And we still haven't brought up the downside. Just stay with us on this if you want to see the downside. So I would imagine that that what we saw was there was this thing where, as you said, we couldn't connect with this one organization because it was all either it had to be reported to this person. And then when they were talking to us, it seemed like they were always actually just reading a script. They weren't actually talking. Whereas when we talked to the people at HubSpot, they were like, oh, that's a really good point. Let me get back to you on that. Right. And they were hearing you. They elevated their esteem for you. They seemed to be interested in the product, and they were empowered to do that, which I think is the main thing, which is why whatever happens in retail, it's like, has that organization empowered the person at the pickup window or at the, on the sales floor? Can they do things that make things better for the people that are the clients, the customers at whatever level? Or do they have to go get approval? Do they have to get that marketed down? Do they have to go submit it in, a request or whatever? So anyway, you can get bogged down in it, and you can be too fluid and too flat, and you can be too layered, although 12 layers of Adobe shorts, pretty good.
Right. So I was reading some other comments on this subject on Reddit, and there was a company that was referenced and how flat their structure was. Past employees commented that it creates cliques where people with charisma and tenure end up leading anyway, right? And so the implication when you have a flat organization where you don't have a boss who asks a boss and orders are carried down in like a military structure means that when you've got this flat organization, those with the most charisma, those with the most tenure end up kind of standing up above the crowd. Yeah. And as a result, it becomes harder for some of the best ideas to surface because it feels like you're constantly competing against people who at the table are able to get their ideas listened to simply because people shut up and listen to them for whatever reason, tenure or charisma, right? And so it makes it a very difficult thing to work with. Now, while that might be inherent in flat organizations, a strong leader can do things to counteract that. And so it's almost like an admired leader has the ability to run a flat organization in a much better way than an admired leader running one with lots of tiers in it.
Yeah, very well
Simply
could be.
because,
Now,
yeah,
think about the fact that when we talk about in the field note that highly agile organizations might have only a couple of layers, maybe 3. And that if you're doing
when you
this
use
well,
the word agile here, you mean you're talking flat? Was that just a word for another word for flat when you say agile?
Agile can mean a lot in different organizations and how fast they adapt and how they empower people. And there's a whole, agile system. I wasn't necessarily defining it that way.
Gotcha.
But what we're saying is when you have fewer layers, you can break down silos, encourage teamwork. You can have people closer to their customers. All of that is good. But let's get, because we only have a minute here. The one thing that happens though is that if you have a super flat organization, you can have a domineering factor that happens because then the founder, the president, the CEO, the person right at the top, there's not like a whole structure all the way through. So then it ends up just being their view. Yes. So it very much has, there can be a downside, and you have to have a leader that says, all right, if we're only going to have a few layers, then I actually have to trust the people in those layers to do the right thing. So there are tremendous benefits to not having too many layers, but there are some risk factors there that you have to take into account, or else you're going to be in big trouble.
Right. Now, the field note ends up wrapping up without a very strong prescription as to like what the ratio actually is to how many layers per, like what your size is or what you're doing. There's no real good recommendation. It's really just considerations, strong considerations. If you're an older organization, chances are you're not very flat, simply because you come out of an era as an older organization that probably has lots of layers, lots of management.
Hard to get rid of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So on your team, I mean, we've heard it said around here, it's your job to create a heaven inside of a hell. And we weren't necessarily talking about the flatness of the organization. But if you have all kinds of layers and you've inherited a team that has 7 layers and you just don't like it, I suppose there's more freedom for you to, instead of feeling like you're changing the entire organization, just make your team better, right? And how do you empower those to feel more flat, right? Without it feeling like you've skip leveled somebody or that you've demoted somebody into something else, right? I don't know that there's a best way to do that, but that's almost like very much what we're saying here of the flatness of it. So I don't know that we can give a prescription in any, unless we're talking about a certain kind of
the prescription is just unnecessary layers, get rid of them. Yeah. If they're not necessary, they're in the way. So you just be saying, well, we have this position and that position and this layer and this approval thing. Well, what is absolutely necessary there? Because that might have worked 20 years ago or 50 years ago, might not work now. Yesterday I saw the musical How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, which was done 60 years ago, on Broadway. My oldest daughter had a role in the production here in Pittsburgh and did fantastic, but you were looking into this snapshot back to like a very corporate structure and how did you rise and get in the mailroom and go here, get to be, one of the account people and then as, vice president. And then you're trying to do it works differently now. And I think that it's good for us to re-examine that. And I think that the more that we can empower people so that they're more connected, but without flattening it so that then a domineering leader is still trying to kind of like hands-on control everything, then it's not going to work. So, but get rid of the unnecessary layers.
Right. What is that, once a year where that kind of evaluation is made? Right.
Yeah.
At least to be thinking organizationally about it, at least once a year.
Yeah, I would think so. Although I think that you're not probably giving enough time for there to be layers added in that fast. Because I think it tends to be more like evolution in epochs or eras. Right. And so I think they've probably evolved that way. But if you're founding a company, if you're an entrepreneur, you can think about this from the beginning. Right. And so you can try to make sure that you're sort of building in, those sort of methodologies. So in any case, this is one of those field notes where there's not an immediate sex appeal to it, but you do have to grapple with it because it is actually where we live, whether you're a teacher in a school, whether you're in a nonprofit, or whether you're in a 40,000 person organization. But what I did learn in the How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, I know we're 2 minutes over, was that the main admonition from the satire book of the time period, was you're looking for your first job, make sure it's in a big enough organization where there's enough people that nobody really knows what anybody else is doing.
Very cynical.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks,
Well,
Mike.
great. I appreciate the conversation today. For those that are listening on, we do this every single day for about 15 minutes to talk about the field note of the day. And we appreciate those that are chiming in and joining us as we discuss it. Thank you.
Dynamite.
All right. Bye now.